As the battle over voting rights continues, we're hearing from the family of Martin Luther King Jr. Of course, today we are celebrating Dr. King. The family is in Washington ahead of tomorrow's debate in the United States Senate. Listen.
And when you look at the long view, history is going to judge all of those who are against voting rights protections and expansions.
So Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer originally set a deadline of today to vote on changing the filibuster rules. Altering the filibuster would allow Democrats to pass voting rights legislation with a simple majority. But on Thursday, Schumer adjourned the Senate and said lawmakers did not have to come back to the floor until tomorrow. He cited concerns about weather and COVID-19. Nikole Killion is following this story for us from Washington, and she joins us now. Nikole, I'm reminded a lot of people will be posting Dr. King's quote in their social media timelines today. The one that I have always kept near and dear to my heart is the one that says life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? And that sort of dovetails with what we're talking about right now. The United States Senate, when can we expect them to convene to debate on voting rights legislation?
Yeah, that's right. Well, in terms of this Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, many declare it as a day on, not a day off. And so that, in essence, is part of the message from the King family on this holiday. As far as the Senate is concerned, look, Leader Schumer had said that he wanted to hold a debate on this voting rights legislation on or by Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Obviously, that's not happening today, as you mentioned, giving some inclement weather in this area and some other dynamics. But the leader does hope to bring this legislation up for debate starting Tuesday. In fact, canceling the Senate's recess, actually postponing it till later this month so that they can tackle this issue. But the challenge is there simply aren't the votes there to support this legislation because Democrats would need at least 10 Republicans to sign on. That has not been the case. Senate Republicans have been very vocal against much of the voting rights legislation that has come before this Congress. And so consequently, Leader Schumer has said that if they cannot pass it, if Republicans do object, then Senate Democrats reserve the right to change the rules. But that's also running into a roadblock because that requires all 50 Democrats to be on board with changing the rules, changing the filibuster. And as you know, Senator Sinema of Arizona gave a very long speech on the Senate floor late last week saying that that is simply something she is not willing to do at this time.
You spoke with Martin Luther King III, his wife, and their daughter yesterday, and you asked them about Senator Sinema's speech last week, where the Arizona senator said that she did not support changing filibuster rules. I want to play some of what the Kings had to say about that.
It is interesting that she is hiding behind the filibuster with that point. I think that the filibuster is not a way to heal the disease of division of which she talked about in this land. The filibuster has been used for over 100 years as it's a Jim Crow relic. It is not the vegetable of peace and freedom of which the banner of which she defined it as. If you look at the filibuster, it was used to block anti-slavery legislation. It was used to block anti-lynching legislation. It was used to block civil rights legislation. It was used last year just to block voting rights debate. So how can the filibuster be seen as a procedure that is a light for freedom, peace, and justice?
So Senator Sinema represents Arizona. The Kings were just in Arizona advocating for voting rights. What do they tell you about that and their attempts to talk to Senator Sinema?
Well, obviously, that visit to Phoenix on Dr. King's actual birthday, the 15th, was significant in terms of trying to put pressure on the senator, perhaps to change her position on this. Martin Luther King III saying that history will view her unkindly for taking this position with respect to the filibuster. In their view, they see it as being contradictory. We do know that Senator Sinema does support this federal voting rights legislation, whether it's the Freedom to Vote Act or the John Lewis Voting Rights Rights Advancement Act. She's a sponsor of both bills, as are the rest of Senate Democrats. And so their argument is, why would you stand in the way of your own bill? And not just Senator Sinema, but Senator Manchin as well. And now they have not had an opportunity to meet with Senator Sinema, although they say they would welcome a meeting with her. They have in the past spoken with Senator Manchin, who is also someone who has opposed changing or abolishing the filibuster, though he's indicated some willingness potentially to changing the rules. And so, they have also met with a number of other Republican lawmakers as well, which is noteworthy. So they say that lobbying campaign will continue. Don't know if they will be on Capitol Hill this week while they are here in Washington, but they are trying to make their voices heard, not only in Arizona, but also here in Washington, where they will be participating in a march later on today.
The King family got to speak with the president last week, also in Atlanta. They were there in Atlanta. What did they tell you about that conversation?
Well, they described it as a productive conversation. And, from their view, they, at this point, really want the White House and the president to put its full weight behind voting rights. And so that, in essence, is their message to the president. And so they believe that the White House and Congress, for that matter, should do all it can to advance the cause of voting rights. They cite what President Biden said, not only in Atlanta, but late last week when he was on Capitol Hill. I was there, where he said, I'm going to, as long as I have breath in my body, I'm going to fight, on this issue of voting rights, even though in the present moment he's not sure if it can get done. And so what the King said is they're going to hold him to that. If he's going to fight for it, fight for it. At the end of the day, they just want to see this get done.
You also asked the Kings what their message is for Americans on today's holiday honoring Martin Luther King Jr. I want to play what Martin Luther King III had to say about that.
I think the message is, number one, be engaged. Right now, it is about protecting, preserving, and expanding voting rights. Be engaged in your democracy. We must salvage democracy, not allow it to go away, as some appear to want to do. So on the King holiday, don't take a day off, but take a day on and be engaged. Call your senator, sign the petition, march across bridges across America, demanding voting rights be protected and preserved.
Yeah, I've heard some people say that even though, this is a day of service, what Martin Luther King Jr. was about was much more than sort of charitable work. And he was about exactly what Martin Luther King III is saying about preserving democracy and equality and civil rights. What is the King family planning to do while they're in Washington and going forward when it comes to the fight for voting rights?
Well, as they put it, there is no celebration without legislation, and so that is why they are holding this march. It's a peace walk here in Washington, D.C. today, where they are going to be walking across the Frederick Douglass Bridge here in Washington. For those familiar, it's over by the baseball stadium, if anybody's checked out a baseball game in this area. But, that is largely symbolic, because if you look back to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, so much of that came about from that landmark moment, tragic as it was, on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, where the late Congressman John Lewis was beaten. And so, in addition to kind of a symbolic parallel as far as walking across a bridge today, the other part of it for them is that they feel that, look, Congress and the White House have been able to get bipartisan infrastructure legislation done. So if they can deliver on bridges, then they want to also see them deliver on voting rights. So that is part of the symbolism in this peace walk that is happening today, which they're doing in partnership with over 100 organizations. There will also be congressional leaders joining them, including Speaker Pelosi and others, Reverend Al Sharpton as well. But, their message going forward, I mean, look, they realize the realities on Capitol Hill. I think they're trying to get past these next 48 hours to see what happens with this debate and with this vote. And if it doesn't succeed, then they pledge to keep trying and to keep fighting on this issue until it gets done. Now, they would not tell me whether or not they think, for instance, Congress should perhaps break up some of this legislation into smaller pieces, whether or not the White House should take executive actions, but they did did say that they believe that there are a number of options and paths that should be considered if this doesn't succeed in the end. So I imagine they will continue to mobilize and activate around this issue, much as the late Dr. King did, to carry out his legacy.
Nikole and Anne-Marie, as you both know, Dr. King said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Nikole, I want to ask you, how does the family feel about that arc today in 2022, sort of big picture?
Well, I asked them if they're frustrated by all of this, and I think that's something that we come to time and again, as far as kind of fighting some of these same fights, whether it's on the issue of voting rights, whether it's on the issue of police reform, which, stalled and ultimately, wasn't necessarily addressed in Congress. And so, their view on this is that, again, you've got to kind of play that long game, the long view. That is something that Dr. King did, change did not happen overnight. It took a lot of persistence. It took a lot of determination on his part. And, as Martin Luther King III put it, he said Dad and his team, they put a team in place to create the climate for change. And so I think that's what you are now seeing his son and his wife, their daughter, Dr. King's granddaughter, try to embody that same type of activism to, again, try to ultimately affect change, even if it does take a while.
All right, Nikole, thank you very much. So if you want to read Nikole's write-up of this interview, just head on over to our website, cbsnews.com.